I want to begin by welcoming a very special guest. We have with us Dr. Patricia Turner, the author of the book that you all have been reading. And it's a real honor to have her here, to have you here, Dr. Turner, all the way from UCLA. But this is, I've been finding out, actually home for you in a way, the original home. And so it's just an honor and it's a real privilege to welcome you and to have you speak to our class. We have watched Ethnic Notions, as I think I told you, and I can say that when I first saw that film, as with so many of us, it's really like you never look at things the same again. And it made such an impression on me as an undergraduate, and it still does, it still holds up. And so we've really been using that kind of, along with your book, using the information and the imagery and the sort of spirit of Marlon Riggs as a filmmaker and what he put into that documentary and all his work. We also watched Black Is, Black Ain't, which has been incredibly helpful as a lens. And so, Dr. Turner's biography goes on and on and on. We'd be here all day if I just, started reading, just even some of her accomplishments. But maybe I will leave it to her to share selections of that might be interesting. But she's, a major force. Folklorist, author, and academic, the executive director of the Reinvention Center, and the vice provost for undergraduate education, is that right? For UCLA. She lives in Los Angeles, California. So I know Nace is very excited because he is an aspiring person in terms of as a performer and artist himself. And so we're really just glad to welcome you here today, Dr. Turner.
Thank you. On the side of informality this afternoon. As Zebulon said, I'm really a local girl. I grew up east of here in Sag Harbor. My father had a farm in Bridgehampton, and my parents came. I don't know how much you know about the ethnic populations of eastern Long Island, but in the 1930s, the potato farmers in Bridgehampton, where there are wineries now, there used to be potato farms. And the potato farmers needed a labor force. They needed someone to work the potato fields. So they would go to black southern communities and basically say the equivalent of, hey, why don't you come up to eastern Long Island and work on our potato fields? You've got, you're working on farms here and you have to deal with Jim Crow. Why don't you come north and work in a rural environment without the Jim Crow? Was the basic message. And my parents were a part of that whole migration from the south to the north, and whole communities went. So if you were to go to Bridgehampton now and interview the more seasoned members of the community, people 75 and over, you would hear that they went to school together in Virginia or North Carolina, and they really all came up. They all came up en masse, and so that's my. Where I was born, obviously with a biography like that. Neither of my parents finished high school. My father had many businesses in Bridgehampton after initially working a bit in a labor force. The last of his businesses was a kind of a funky farm that lots of people still remember as Turner's Farm. My mother cleaned houses. If you know the Hamptons, you know there are lots of nice houses to be cleaned there, very palatial ones. I cleaned houses in high school, and in college. I went to Pearson in Sag Harbor from kindergarten through 12th grade. 54 kids in my graduating class, most of whom I had learned to read with. I got a scholarship, a Regents scholarship. I got a Regents scholarship, and I did my undergrad at SUNY Oneonta. What's interesting about being invited to speak to you here at Stony Brook was, of course, if you're growing up there, the closest good school was Stony Brook. That was the one that your parents wanted you to go to because of the proximity to home in those days. Most of my classmates and I did not want to go to Stony Brook. It had nothing to do with the caliber of the institution. We just didn't want to be that close to home. And so a couple of people, including my own nephew, did go to Stony Brook. But as I said, I did my undergrad upstate at Oneonta and then worked for a couple of years and did my graduate work at UC Berkeley, which was where I met Marlon, and I'll tell you a little bit of that whole story. I think the SUNY system is wonderful. You're getting a great education here. The taxpayers of New York, in underwriting your education, along I'm sure with your own contributions, are serving you well. When I look back at the people that I graduated from Oneonta with, from all of the other SUNY schools, if you went to high school in Long Island, you know that your friends sort of spread out across the SUNY system. And the people of my generation who went to the SUNY schools and applied themselves, they've had great adulthoods, great careers, and I was very fortunate at Oneonta. I had terrific faculty members there. I took my work seriously. I had mentors who strongly encouraged me to consider going on to graduate school and getting a PhD. Now, growing up in my household, I don't think I even knew anyone who had a PhD. I don't think that I had an understanding of what the biography was of someone who became a college professor, of someone who wrote books. It wasn't in my sphere of things to think about. But my faculty at Oneonta encouraged me in that direction, encouraged me to apply to UC Berkeley because one in particular felt that a program that they had there in folklore mapped on with the kinds of things that I was writing about in my undergraduate papers at Oneonta. She also knew that if I went to Berkeley and got into the program that she thought made the most sense for me, I would have full graduate funding for 5 years. And this is another thing that if you're a first-generation college student, you don't understand, right? You look in the catalog. That's how we understood things in those days. There weren't web pages. You looked in the catalog to find out the rules of the university. And you saw this number, which was the tuition, and it was just a ridiculous number. And you thought to yourself, how in the world am I going to come up with the money for that number? My mother is cleaning houses. How am I going to do this? And because of good faculty mentoring, she said, pay no attention to that number. Pay no attention to that number. If they want you, they'll pay you. What are you talking about? If they want me, they'll pay you. What are you talking about? She goes, you apply. If you pass their admissions threshold, they will give you a TA-ship, they will give you a stipend. You don't have to pay that number. Nobody pays that number in a place like Berkeley. And so I applied, and she was right. I got a TA-ship, I got a fellowship. I never had to pay that number. But think of all of the people who look at the number and take it seriously. It functions as a deterrent. They go, oh my God, how am I going to go to graduate school if you have to pay that number? I'm here to tell you, you don't have to pay that number if you go to a good place, which I was fortunate enough to do. So I got into Berkeley. I started TAing. I started taking classes in folklore with a very eminent faculty member there. His name was Alan Dundes, and he was at that juncture and for most of his career probably the best known professor of folklore in the world. You go to Africa, people know Alan Dundes' work on African folklore. You go to Italy, he's gotten the highest honor an academic can get in Italy. You go to China, people know Alan Dundes' work. Absolutely preeminent, and he'd written a book on African American folklore, big thick book, titled Mother Wit from the Laughing Barrel. And it was a very successful book. Another faculty member I had, someone by the name of Lawrence Levine, had written a book on African American folklore titled Black Culture and Black Consciousness, which won the highest history award that year, the Bancroft History Prize, for its contribution. So I was studying with these folks, and a local woman by the name of Jan Faulkner had been for many years collecting images of Black people, African Americans, Africans, anything that suggested that, and just sort of putting those things in her apartment and in boxes. She would go into antique stores and she would say, do you have anything Black? So this is the this is the mid to late 70s and early 1980s that we're talking about. And Jan had been collecting sheet music and statues. She'd been collecting postcards and taking advertisements out of magazines and amassing all of these materials. And people around who knew her knew that she had these materials. And someone said to her, you know, you don't see images of Black people in very many places. At that juncture, it was considered politically incorrect to display a derogatory image of a Black person. We'd already passed that threshold. But there weren't all of that, there were not all of that many positive images out there either. This is before the Cosby Show was on television. This is still a period where the landscape was really really quite white. I noticed one of the words on your vocabulary list is hegemony. And this was a real hegemonic moment in terms of white culture. And Jan just kept collecting these things. And someone said, you know, having all of this stuff in boxes in your apartment, and you know, is all very well and good, but aren't you going to do something with it? And she said, well, and she was a social services worker. She says, I don't know what to do with it. I think someone should do something with it, but I don't know what to do with it myself. So they arranged for her to meet with the curator of a local museum in Berkeley, who came over to her apartment and looked at the materials and said, I would love to do an exhibition of these materials, and with the exhibition publish a catalog about the history and meaning of these artifacts that you've collected. Would you be willing to write something like that? She looked at the curator and said, no, I am a social worker. I'm not a writer. I just collect these things. I don't know the history of them. I don't know that. I said, well, you know, we are here in Berkeley with, and I have to say at the time that I was there, Berkeley was ranked #1 in the world for graduate school. We're in the city with the best graduate program in the world. Maybe somebody over there can help with this exhibit. So the curator connected Jan with my professors, with with Professor Levine, who had written Black Culture and Black Consciousness, with Professor Dundies, who had written Motherwit from the Laughing Barrel, and said, we want to do a catalog on this exhibit. We want you to see these things. Nothing's been written about these things that Jan has. Can you help us? And they looked at the materials, and Professor Dundies in particular said, I definitely think the exhibit should happen. I definitely think there should be a catalog on this exhibit. But I don't think I should write anything for you. I think this is an opportunity for the next generation, for graduate students to work. And I want you to work with Pat Turner, because I know she's interested in some of these items. And, I had a fledgling little collection of my own. So through Professor Dundies, I got involved with the exhibit and with some of the research for the catalog. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The exhibit opened to widespread critical acclaim. It was reviewed in newspapers. No one had ever walked across a museum floor and seen images like the ones that you saw in Ethnic Notions, a product called, nigger hair smoking tobacco, darky toothpaste, the most derogatory images of the black body juxtaposed with alligators chasing them. No one had seen that kind of thing in a fancy schmancy museum before all of this. And we thought really hard about the catalog that went through it, but it was a very moving exhibit to people. One of the people who went to the exhibit, recent Harvard graduate, documentary and aspiring documentary filmmaker at that time, Marlon Riggs. Marlon went to the exhibit and said, I want to do a major film about this exhibition. And he and Jan connected. They had very good chemistry. And she said, okay, it's fine with me if you have my permission to do a film. I'll do what I can to help you, but I'm a social worker. I'm not a historian, but you can film my things. You can do whatever you want. So a film like Ethnic Notions, particularly being that it was Marlon's first film, it requires a significant financial investment. And so the way in which documentary filmmakers in those days, and to a certain extent these days too, get the money to do this is by applying for grants from some federal and some private agencies. So Marlon began the process of applying for the grants. Part of the component of the grants application process are letters of support from people who say, if this documentary gets made, I as a faculty member will use it in my classes. This is something that I think will be a contribution that will be meaningful. And I will even be available to the filmmaker as an advisor to make sure that the history is accurate and everything works out the way it's supposed to. So this was Marlon's first, it was going to be his first full-length film. So he didn't have a track record himself. He really needed the strongest possible letters to get the funding agencies to give him the money to make the film. So he went to the same people who were listed in the catalog as faculty members at UC Berkeley, who supported the exhibit and said, will you help me with my film? Will you act as historical advisors for the film? Will you appear on camera in interviews? Will you, write the kind of letter that will get me funding? And Professor Dundies, who was my primary mentor, looked at him and said, I will write you the letter you need. And remember, this is somebody known internationally. But I won't help you. I'll write you the letter. but I want you to use my student. I want you to use Pat Turner. She's the one who knows this stuff. I'm not going to take credit for her research. You put her on camera, you give her the credit for this. You can use my name to get the grant for the actual work. I want you to use Pat. And that's how Marlon and I met, because basically Professor Dundee sort of held his letter hostage to using me for the work. And it was a wonderful professional gift. Marlon did get the grants because he had letters from Alan Dundes and Larry Levine, so he was able to make the film that he wanted to make. And Levine, if you've seen the film, you know Larry is in there. He's one of the talking heads in there. Alan's not in there because Alan said, use Pat. You know, this is a young person's film, and this doesn't belong to me, you know, old white guy at Berkeley. This belongs to somebody else. So it was a terrific, as I said, it was a terrific professional gift that he gave me. And one of the things that we had to think about, both with the film and with the exhibit, was how to take these artifacts that were in boxes in Jan's house and on the shelves and ascribe some kind of order to all of that so that we could tell a story with those materials. So one way in which you could tell a story with those materials would be to organize them by type. So by type would have been an organization where we would have looked at just the print material, the postcards, the posters, the books, the comic books, things that were in print. Another type would be the three-dimensional objects and just deal with those. Another type might be the films that we had, the cartoons, the television shows. But we knew that there were themes repeated across all of those arenas. So we quickly dismissed that idea in favor of identifying some themes that you could find in print in the objects, on the films. So one of the ones that Marlon was most intrigued by, and I was as well, was when we kept finding the alligators. We found, and I, you know, in the film itself, this is a fairly short sequence, but recall we found cartoons that had alligators chasing black men and children up a tree. We found a plethora of postcards that had alligators threatening black people in some kind of an environment. We